So that people can really understand the case and then what happened, why you were considered a criminal in this, when Chevron is getting away with everything. So you're an attorney in the United States. You took on a case in Ecuador, right? So how did you get involved in that case to begin with?
So the backstory is when I was 1 year out of law school in the early 1990s, and I was asked to go on an investigation trip with some other attorneys and doctors to determine, what had happened in this area where we had heard there was a lot of oil pollution. And I first went down there in April of 1993. There were about 10 of us in this delegation. All of us were just utterly shocked at what we saw. I mean, we expected to find contamination. This was like apocalyptic proportions. I mean, there were Olympic-sized swimming pools of oil waste gouged out of the floor of the Amazon rainforest. There were pipes on the sides of these waste pits that were taking the oil waste down into streams and rivers that people were drinking out of, using for their drinking water and their fishing and their bathing. I mean, essentially, Chevron, it was Texaco did this, by the way, but I say Chevron because Chevron bought Texaco and they're now defending the case and they own this problem now. But, this was done by Texaco, now Chevron, um, to increase their already high profits to utterly obscene levels. And I would say there was a real element of racism in it. Like, I don't think look, obviously there's a lot of contamination in the United States and oil fields, but like a lot of that is poor design, a lot of it's accidents, old wells. Okay, what happened in Ecuador that's really distinctive is they engineered the design of this system of oil extraction to pollute. That as every day they were dumping at the height of the operation 5 million gallons of scalding hot production waters into rivers and streams. These waters have heavy metals, they have carcinogenic chemicals, and they're dumping it into rivers and streams that indigenous peoples are drinking out of without telling them. Okay, bad enough they did it, no warning. People kept drinking, cancer rates are skyrocketing, thousands of people likely have died, although no one knows the exact number because they won't pay for a normal kind of health study. But there have been some studies, peer-reviewed studies, that show skyrocketing rates of cancer. Childhood leukemia. Leukemia is not a type of cancer that young children get generally. It's a cancer older people get after smoking and the like. I mean, there's people, dozens of children under the age of 6 months with leukemia, okay, in this region. So the health problems are off the charts. It was done deliberately. It's probably one of the most egregious corporate crimes in world history. And the experts who looked at it started to call it the Amazon Chernobyl because it was as bad as Chernobyl. I mean, it was like a nuclear accident through oil pollution in this pristine ecosystem. And when I first went down there in 1993, it really changed my life. I'm like, I'm working on this. We're going to do something. And we
Mhm.
organized and got a lawsuit together. And here we are now, over 30 years later. We won the lawsuit, but they won't pay.
So what was Chevron's motive for polluting? Was it because they were saving money and they were allowed to? They were figuring, hey, this is a country that doesn't have the regulations in place, so we're allowed to dump. We're saving money. We don't have to do all of the things, go through all the hoops that we would have to somewhere else. I mean, what was their motive? Or did they just want to
I think
poison the
that's a good
people to
description.
poison the people? Okay, so it was a
I think
money, it was a
look,
money saving
it was a money
tactic.
play. I mean, look, I'm not saying they went down there, we want to kill people. I mean, that's not how they think. They think, how can we make the most money with the least amount of cost?
Yeah.
And I think the reason they dumped is because it was cheaper to just discharge the oil waste into rivers and streams than it would be to dispose of it properly. And the way to dispose of it properly, by the way, is you build these reinjection wells where you take the carcinogenic oil waste and you re-inject it thousands of feet back into the ground where it can't harm anybody. And they were just dumping it into surface waters in the Amazon. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
talking about pristine surface waters that these communities were using for thousands of years and were prospering and thriving and they were healthy. There was no word, until Chevron showed up, for cancer in their languages. A lot of the people there, the elderly people, when I first went down, they were well over 100 years old. I mean, there was no cancer, okay, until the oil showed up, until the chemicals started to be dumped into the environment. So it was a pure money play. And also it was a calculation, right? Like, Ecuador had never actually had an oil industry until they showed up. So there was no regulatory authorities that had any that were in place. And over time, they did create a regulatory body, but it had no teeth. No one knew what they were doing. There was no real expertise in Ecuador to monitor this industry. So they took advantage of that. Like, oh, we can dump. We'll never be caught. We'll get away with it. And we'll make even more money than the large amount of profit we're already making. And I want to just say this, like when I showed up in year 25 of this awful situation, and we filed a lawsuit because Texaco and then Chevron had the mentality that they could just do what they wanted down there. And they really had the mentality of those who operate with impunity. They actually experienced our lawsuit as some sort of affront to them, like some sort of unfair treatment. Wait a second. We didn't bargain for the fact that the villagers in Ecuador could actually sue us over this. And they actually experienced our lawsuit. They got really angry about it. And they experienced it as some sort of violation of their rights. It was the craziest thing, even though they were the ones who had poisoned these indigenous communities for almost 30 years.
So how did you win the lawsuit then? If there were no laws that regulated their pollution dumping, how did you win?
Well, there were laws. There were actually, Ecuador had laws prohibiting contamination of the environment, of the ecosystem, and in the contract that Texaco signed with Ecuador's government, they were prevented from contaminating. I mean, there were all sorts of laws. My point when I said that like they felt like they could get away with it is there was no regulatory authorities and no courts that were holding them accountable. But the laws
Ah,
were on the books. The laws were on the
mhm.
books. So when we came down, and started to litigate the case, we used the laws that have been in existence. I mean, there's a law dating in Ecuador's civil code dating back to 1861, that
Hmm.
prevents harm to the environment. So we used these laws and it drove them crazy because they just assumed, since those laws had never really been used effectively until our legal team started to do so, that it would never happen. So, the reason we won the case is because we proved the case under the law. And,
Yeah.
we actually submitted tens of thousands of chemical sampling results, like literally for 3 or 4 years. We had experts, they had their experts go around to these contaminated sites, take soil samples, water samples, submit them to independent laboratories to really test how much pollution there was out there. And, so there were thousands of these sampling results that proved that there were in crazy levels of contamination. It's not like they were just a little bit over the standard. They were sometimes 30, 40, 50, 100 times over. And there was massive pollution out there. I mean, frankly, it was an outrage. We had to sit there for 3 years to try to prove it when it was so obvious you could just sort of look at it. But we did prove it.
Yeah.
And again, that
So,
drove them even crazier. But that's why we won the case. We presented the evidence, the laws were there, and the court, based on that evidence and the laws, ruled in our favor.
and this was in an Ecuadorian court.
Yes. And let me be clear about another matter. We initially sued in federal court in New York way back in 1993. They were the ones who wanted the case in Ecuador. They fought for 10 years to move it to Ecuador. And as a condition of the US court saying, okay, you can litigate this in Ecuador, they were forced to accept the jurisdiction of Ecuador's courts. And they also were forced to promise that they would pay any adverse judgment. Well, they went back on both commitments because when we got there, they challenged the jurisdiction of Ecuador's courts. They lost. And when we won the case, when there was this adverse judgment against them, they then simply refused to pay. And now we're playing a cat and mouse game where the communities in Ecuador are having to hire lawyers in other countries to go chase them down and try to get their assets. I mean, it's a complete abusive process. It's an abusive procedure. It's an abuse of the law. And that's what Chevron is doing. And what's so crazy, and sort of get going back to my earlier point of why I was locked up for, over 4 times the max length of my sentence, is these corporations now have so much influence and control over so many of our courts that these judges are actually either kind of in agreement that they don't want environmental cases at this level to happen, or if they're not, they're sort of intimidated to go up against the army of lawyers that fossil fuel companies like Chevron are capable of deploying into court. I mean, Cam, understand, When they prosecuted me, okay, I had a couple of lawyers helping me. They had 160 lawyers working on the case to try to essentially destroy me. Now, I don't know what, I don't mean to sort of, how one conveys what it's like as a human rights lawyer to be targeted by 160 corporate lawyers at one time. Man, it's frightening. It's frightening. But
Yeah.
like, luckily, I'm a pretty good lawyer myself, and I am a resilient guy, and I know a lot of lawyers who are good, who were helping, and we got through it. And here I am. I mean, they thought I would quit. They thought I would give up. Maybe they thought something would happen to me in prison. But like, we've gotten through it, and we're all actually much stronger for it. And the irony is they still face the great financial risk of maybe having to pay this judgment if these enforcement actions in other countries can get going targeting their assets.
Okay, so explain to us how it ended up being turned on to you. So, first of all, the $9.5 billion judgment that they were supposed to pay, they still have not paid this. Have they been appealing this? Like, how are they getting away with not paying it?
This is how they get away with it. First of all, I think they're going to have to pay it at some point. But the way they delay is, this is sort of a fundamental problem with international justice, is courts are national in scope and multinational corporations are multinational in scope, and like, courts can't compete. I've seen this time and time again throughout my career. The judgments in Ecuador, thinking they were going to lose several years before the case ended, they they removed all their assets from, hold on a second, they removed all their assets from Ecuador. So when we won the judgment in Ecuador, there was nothing to collect. Okay, that
Okay.
necessitated the communities to go to Canada, for example, where they have a lot of assets. And we started to litigate in Canada, but that adds several years of legal battles to an already very long case, because it's cheaper for them to just pay lawyers in Canada than to pay this $10 billion judgment to the communities they poison. So these litigations can go on and on and on unless courts and judges step up and really
Hmm.
enforce the law. So the way they
Right.
delay the payment is they just keep litigating, filing motions, hiring armies of lawyers, trying to tie the communities up in court so they don't have to pay the judgment. And there's never really a resolution. Of course, not having a resolution favors them because
Right.
they don't have to pay. So we are battling to get through that. And by the way, that dynamic is not just in this case, it's in a lot of these types of cases. I see this a lot where corporations use the procedural part of the law to just pay lawyers to tie up their victims, the people they've harmed, and their lawyers for years and years and years. So they don't, because it's cheaper to do that than to actually pay for the harm they caused.
Right. So, and I would imagine that if you were able to successfully beat them and get a $9.5 billion judgment, they're probably worried that this would have a snowball effect and there would be others as well.
I would say that's a key point. Absolutely. They feel like they can want to invest I mean, I think they've invested, we estimate, about $3 billion fighting us over the years. That's an insane amount of money, maybe the most expensive corporate defense in history. And
Yeah.
the reason is they know that if the communities in Ecuador, the indigenous communities, the farmer communities in the rainforest, collect a judgment of this size, it will inspire other vulnerable communities around the world to sue them and to create these liabilities and to figure out they can use our model, our fundraising model. We have an international legal team. Like, we really chartered a path that scares the hell out of Chevron and the entire fossil fuel industry. So they're sort of collectively kind of have a vested interest in blocking the enforcement of the judgment and going after the lawyer. By the way, I still can't travel. Like, they took my passport. I haven't left the country, United States, in 5 years. And
Wow.
I went to Ecuador over 250 times to litigate this case. I haven't been down there in 5 years. So one of their goals is to block me from traveling. The other goal is to keep me under the threat of possible detention. And this is stuff right out of the playbook of authoritarian regimes, Orban in Turkey, I'm sorry, in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin, there's a lot of leaders in the world who do this. Well, there's a corporation that's doing it right now in the United States called Chevron, and it's the same damn thing. It's even worse
Right.
because it's a private corporation, not even a government.
Okay, so now let's get to how they turned their sights onto you. So where you tell us where were you where you refused to turn over these confidential files? Was this in New York or was this in Ecuador?
It was in New York. Basically, so this is the sequence. Okay, we won the case in Ecuador, the landmark case in 2013. They refused to pay. We then started to enforce that judgment against their assets in Canada. We won a Supreme Court decision against them in 2015. They felt enormous risk. They then went back to this New York judge and said and they got him, by the way, to order me to pay them millions of dollars to compensate them for paying lawyers to go after me. They basically wanted to pay them for their persecution of me through this law firm, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. And I did not have the money. I didn't have millions of dollars. I'm a human rights guy. And then they used the fact I couldn't pay the money to ask the judge to order me to give them my computer and confidential case file so they could search for, they had this theory I'm hiding all this money, which is BS, but it was just a pretext. And at that point, that would have allowed them to penetrate attorney-client privilege, see confidential information. I appealed that order. I thought the order was wrong, unconstitutional. And while I was appealing Judge Kaplan's order that I turn over my case file to Chevron lawyers, unheard of order, he then charged me with criminal contempt of court for refusing to obey an order of his that I was appealing. That's how crazy it got. And at that point is when he had me locked up pre-trial as a risk of flight. They basically concocted this scheme to lock me up because we were making progress against their assets in Canadian courts. I mean, that's my view of it. And that's why they did it. And why, by the way, it's still going on. I mean, even though I'm free from detention, I can't leave the country. I cannot have a bank account without them potentially taking the money in it. They took my law license without a hearing, and they've sort of created a situation around my life where I can't have the rights of everyone else. Like, for example, if I try to get a job that pays me money, they could then take my money because I owe them millions of dollars. So right now, the way I support myself, people should know this, is I have a legal defense fund that's housed in a law firm in Seattle. The law firm's called Friedman Rubin, and people donate to this fund. I've had, thank God, a lot of people who hear my story who make small contributions, and out of that, I'm able to pay my legal fees and pay myself some money so I can actually live because I cannot get a job because of the encumbrances that Chevron has put on my life. And this has gone on for years and years and years. And it's a damn outrage. And again, that's another reason why I'm urging President Biden to do something about it. He needs to pardon me for all of these reasons.
Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iverson Show. If you want to watch the full show, visit KimIversonShow.com. The show airs every Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Again, it's KimIversonShow.com. See you then.